In other words, according to this book, there are three things that stand in the way of this totalitarian state described in Brave New World. I recently read Brave New World for the first time, and let me tell you, it's a little bit disturbing. Brave New World is about a kind of post-apocalyptic civilization. It's not exactly post-apocalyptic, and most of the images that come to mind when I say those words don't apply to this one. It's a world where everyone is happy. It's a world where everything has been remade according to a totalitarian, centralized vision. And unlike 1984, with which it is sometimes compared, it is a totalitarian vision where everyone is happy. All of the characters are born in factories. They are predestined to a particular caste in life, and their ability perfectly matches their occupation so that they're never dissatisfied. They're also conditioned from birth to inhabit a particular role within society so that they feel comfortable there. And then, if they ever do experience any sort of discomfort, there's always drugs and recreational sex to fill the void. Having been born in a factory, everyone comes into this world as a total individual. There is no relation of a father and mother. In fact, those are nasty words in this culture. And no one has brothers and sisters, no one has cousins, no one has any sort of close bonds with any other humans. They exist in exactly two modes: as a perfect individual and as a unit of the greater whole, of the greater society. And let me tell you, it's a disturbing vision. Not to give away too many plot spoilers, although the book is over 70 years old, so, you have been warned. But there's a character who is not from this society who eventually comes into it and is able to experience it as a brave new world. Having not been born in it, he brings that outsider perspective. And in this world, there is no literature, there's no art, there's nothing of any meaning or substance because all suffering has been brought out of human lives. Everyone is happy, and they just eat, drink, and be merry because there isn't anything else to keep them going. And it's disturbing. But that's not what I want to talk about. In this video, what I would really like to talk about is a monologue that is given by one of the world controllers at the beginning of the book. The world controller is Mustafa Mond. He's basically the head honcho who's orchestrating the society. And he tells a story about its history and says how the world came to be and the three things they had to destroy to be able to make it possible. In other words, according to this book, there are three things that stand in the way of this totalitarian state described in Brave New World. And they are self-sufficiency, meaning farming and self-reliance and going for more of a self-reliant, simple life, in other words, consuming less. The second one is the family, particularly the nuclear family, with mothers and fathers raising their children. And the third thing is culture, which I'm going to extend to mean art, music, literature, and history. Mustafa Mond leaned forward, shook a finger at them. "Just try to realize it," he said, and his voice sent a strange thrill quivering along their diaphragms. "Try to realize what it was like to have a viviparous mother." Live birth. That smutty word again. But none of them dreamed this time of smiling. Try to imagine what living with one's family meant. They tried, but obviously without the smallest success. And do you know what a home was? They shook their heads. Home, a few small rooms, stiflingly over-inhabited by a man, by a periodically teeming woman, by a rabble of boys and girls of all ages. No air, no space, an under-sterilized prison, darkness, disease, and smells. The controller's evocation was so vivid that one of the boys, more sensitive than the rest, turned pale at the mere description and was on the point of being sick. So, it's kind of interesting. In the modern school system that we have, children are segregated by age. In other words, you have reduced diversity on that one thing, age. All the kids are roughly within a year of each other. All of the age difference that gives you so much status in elementary school is like a couple of months. And that's a weird thing. What the family means against totalitarianism, in my opinion, more than anything else, is diversity. Your first real acquaintance with diversity in your life is the fact that you had to live with people who were different from you at close quarters that you did not choose. You did not choose these people, particularly if you had siblings. and you had to get along with them, and they did things different and annoying, and you had to live with them. These ideals of tolerance for differences, the fact that you have to negotiate on an ongoing basis, the fact that a single centralized plan is never really enforceable within a home, that's the first level of diversity. And it might not even be the most important. I mean, it's the most important for your personal education. But there's another form of diversity that's perhaps even more important that comes with this idea of families. And that is the difference in education or conditioning between families. One family may be very religious, one might not. One might have a very strong sense of family culture, one might not. One might put the toilet paper roll facing inward, one might have the toilet paper roll facing outward. And these differences matter. Anyone who has gotten married understands how different two families can be. In negotiating what the new family is going to be, you have to bring together the culture, and there's a surprising amount of conflict between the cultures of two families, any two families, even if they're from the same quote-unquote culture. And that diversity is key. For as long as that kind of diversity exists, the reason why I think the family is so dangerous to a totalitarian state is diversity. Diversity of vision, diversity of purpose, diversity of experience, diversity of education and conditioning. And for as long as that is possible, you don't have cookie-cutter humans that can be organized by the control of the centralized state. In addition to that raw core principle of diversity, there's a second thing, and that is that these bonds, these small local bonds that humans have, we come into this world in families, without exception. Everyone has a mother and a father, even if it was in a test tube. And these bonds that you have with your blood relatives or your adopted relatives or just the family that you grew up with, I mean, the principle is that you have a local, non-universal relationship that in many ways trumps the universal relationship. And some people say that that's a bad thing. I don't. I think it's an incredibly important thing that we are organized locally. First as an individual, then as a family, then as a community, branching out until we reach the world. Not the individual straight to the world. That kind of universalism is dangerous because anything that's centralized has a single point of failure. But families throw a kink in that because of diversity, especially the diversity of upbringing, and then this idea of the local small units that compete for your loyalty. Together on the family note, one of the things that had to be overcome was a prohibition against sleep teaching. In other words, centralized or standardized conditioning for people. Sleep teaching was actually prohibited in England. There was something called liberalism. Parliament, if you know what that was, passed a law against it. The records survive. Speeches about liberty of the subject. Liberty to be inefficient and miserable. Freedom is to be a round peg in a square hole. So these three things that had to be destroyed were the family, self-sufficiency, and culture. Now on the self-sufficiency one, there's some very interesting stuff there. The second obstacle in the way of the totalitarian state envisioned in Brave New World is self-sufficiency. Now, why would that be a problem? Mustafa Mond mentions that in the forward march toward the Brave New World, there was a reactionary movement against what they were trying to do. He called it conscientious objection on an enormous scale. Anything not to consume. Back to nature. People reacting against consuming and trying to go back to nature, which sounds a lot like the movements that we saw in the 30s and the 70s and around 2008. 800 simple lifers were mowed down by machine guns at Golders Green. Well, that seems a little harsh. I mean, why would you want to mow down simple lifers? Can't you just leave them in peace? Like, why bother with them? I mean, they're just kind of doing their own thing, right? And toward the end of the book, that's actually what the main character John does, as he goes and sets up a garden and tries to become a little self-sufficient island. I mean, rather badly, by this lighthouse. There is a reason why this idea of self-sufficiency is a threat to totalitarianism, and that is because anyone who is self-sufficient cannot be controlled. If you are dependent wholly and completely on someone, they control you. If, for instance, I produced all the food in the world, I get to choose the price and the terms, and you will dance to my tune if I will be the one doling out food. And if I threaten to withhold that from you, I can destroy you. That's all that it takes. If you consume everything that you use, if you have to get it from someone else, then collectively those other people control you. Now, if there's lots of suppliers, then none of them have a very strong claim on you. Supply and demand allow you to choose someone else to buy from. And that, is some power. But if there's only one producer and they control all of it, if there's a true monopoly, as there would be under a state-controlled monopoly, centralized production, then, they own you. And anyone you don't own in a system like that can vote against you, can act against you, can do whatever they want. They're wild cards. They're uncontrolled elements. And for that reason, that very violent reaction makes a little bit of sense, because it's dangerous. They're independent. They don't need you, and so you can't control them. And so they can do what they want. Say what they want. Dependence is one of those principles that rears its ugly head in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different places. The easiest ones to imagine relate to food and ideas like siege warfare, which is basically the duel of the pantries. The person on the inside of the wall is trying to say, I hope that I can outlast you on food, while you hope that you can outlast me with the supplies that you've gathered around my castle. It's basically duel of the pantries. Whoever has the bigger pantry wins. The thing that's kind of interesting about dependence is it applies to things like platforming as well. This is one reason why I am quite excited about the number of alternative platforms there are to YouTube. I love YouTube. I learned how to make the rose that you see back there for my wife on YouTube. YouTube has a deep place in my heart. I've gone to YouTube for entertainment for years and for knowledge of all kinds of things esoteric and awesome. The trouble is, if YouTube becomes truly centralized, or if, the amount of reliance that we as viewers have on YouTube is scary, because it means that the content creators that run afoul of YouTube, to the extent that YouTube wants to interfere in that, they can. And that doesn't mean necessarily that they will, although power corrupts, and if you have the power, you generally use it. But that they can. YouTube is in a position where it can really mess with free speech. And that's a similar sort of application of this idea of dependence, applied to information rather than the necessities of life. Although information is really a necessity, so I think it's in the same family. The third of these principles, or pillars, that Brave New World had to destroy on its way into being was culture. Mustafa Mann describes these people going back to culture. Yes, actually to culture. You can't consume much if you sit still and read books. Then came the famous British Museum massacre. 2,000 culture fans gassed with dichlorethyl sulfide. Again, the reaction seems overdone, overviolent. Why would you care if people are paying attention to art or history or literature? Why are these things dangerous to a totalitarian regime? This one is particularly interesting to me because I actually teach at a small liberal arts college, and the liberal arts, when taught well, is about thinking for one's self. And here's how that works. If you study history, you're in a weird spot, because you now understand two worlds, or maybe it's easier to imagine with two cultures. Let's say you learn Dutch, and you now speak Dutch and English, okay? You now have two languages, and if you speak both of them well, you're in a position to judge Dutch because you speak English. You have a vantage point to use to study Dutch. You can say, well, Dutch is different because of this, 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 and this. But you also have a vantage point to judge English from Dutch, and to say, well, English is a weird language because it does this, 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 and this. And this puts you in a really strange spot. You're suddenly between two worlds, able to see both through the eyes of the other. And that's useful. That's incredibly useful, because suddenly you can have ideas about language itself. Similarly, you can have this with culture. And even with your own culture in the past, let's say that you understand the culture from 80 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 200 years ago in a particular place. As you gain this sort of breadth, you, the student of history, are put in an unusual spot where you can judge the past by the standards of the present, and the present by the standards of the past. Now, if you're cynical and very naive, you might say that, well, that means that all standards are relative and no culture is better than any other, and good and bad are things that don't actually exist, and truth is totally a fiction and all this stuff. Like I said, if you're incredibly naive and cynical, the thing that might also do is put you in a position to develop your sense of judgment. You as a person can detect subtle variations of better and worse. No one can tell me that child abuse is okay if it's from a culture that condones it. There are things that are wrong, or maybe better said, more wrong and less wrong. Because I think when we think in absolutes, in terms of what is good and bad, the conversation gets muddy and we don't get anywhere fast. But can you see what is better and worse? Can you imagine a culture judging itself and saying, what would make our culture, as of right now, better? Better, not perfect, better. And that compass that humans have is something that can be developed. Study of the liberal arts cultivates your ability and also your reliance on that inner sense of judgment, that ability to determine better and worse and truer and less true, or more trustworthy and less trustworthy is probably a better way to describe that. Now, that ability, and also beauty, art does a similar thing, where if you look at two pieces of art, you are in the position of being a judge. Which one speaks to you more? Which one seems more true, more beautiful? Which one grabs you? There is a difference, and it's really hard to articulate, but that does not mean that it's not real. That ability is dangerous to a totalitarian state because it means someone acts on their own conscience, a well-developed, honed, sharpened conscience. That is dangerous. That's where you get conscientious objectors. That's where you get satyagraha, this idea that Gandhi had of civilly disobeying, or Thoreau, you have this idea of civil disobedience. I mean, even Cicero has this idea that the law is just only to a point, and that you yourself are capable of developing your judgment to the point where you judge the law as well. And you follow the good ones, and you obey custom as far as it is good to do so. And when your conscience says no, you stop obeying, and you do what the conscience says to do, which, may it be as peaceful as possible. That is dangerous. Perspective, breadth, the ability to hear multiple voices, because when you hear multiple voices, guess what, again, you are forced to do? You're forced to judge. If you hear only one voice, or one voice drowns out all the others, then you can suppress your judgment. You can let it atrophy just like any other muscle or ability. And if you hear only the one voice and allow your own sense of conscience to atrophy and go along with lies long enough, then you become compliant. And again, easy to control. And so that is why culture is so dangerous to a totalitarian state, is because the true study of culture, that thing that we used to call the liberal arts, liberal from the word liberty, same root. It's from an old Latin word liber, which is a word for bark. It's what they used to make paper out of. And so if you have a books education, a culture education, it is the thing that makes you capable of being free. Liber, used as an adjective, is the opposite of slavery, the opposite condition to being a slave. It is the education that makes you capable of being free, or of not being a slave. I find this book fascinating on a number of levels. It is a disturbing account of a brave new world where the totalitarian utopian vision has been fulfilled. And it's not a world full of gulags. I mean, even the dissidents in this world are treated quite fairly. The ones who are intellectual enough to question and find themselves kicking against the pricks are sent to islands to be with other intellectuals, and they're made harmless, but they're not treated badly. They're sent to an island to talk their ideas and to be creative and just not to bother the rest of the population. So it's not gulags, it's not violence, it's not bloodshed that's the dangerous, scary thing here. It's the complacency. It's the lack of humanity in the people, that the people in this thing are happy, but they're also children. Lenina is so interesting because she is absolutely childlike innocent, and also incapable of making decisions for herself. She's not, in a certain sense, an adult or a fully realized human yet. And that to me, is the scariest thing in totalitarianism, is that if you're going to be a creative, thinking, conscience-driven human, there is no place for you in a totalitarian regime, because you think too much for yourself and can't be controlled, or predicted, or controlled. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe below, and please leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you think about these three pillars that have to be taken out, these existential threats against totalitarianism, of the family with all of its messy diversity, of self-sufficiency with its rejection of the ideal of dependence and consumerism, and this idea of culture as a way of fostering judgment and independent human thinking and deciding ability. In addition to that, if you would like to pick up a copy of this book, I'm going to leave an Amazon affiliate link below in the description. Your purchase doesn't actually increase your purchase price to go through an Amazon affiliate link, but it does help to support our channel. And if you'd like to go the extra mile and support us, you can find a link for that at goodandbasic.com. We deeply appreciate it. See you next time.